A millionaire paid a homeless woman to have his child. But when the baby was born, The rain fell in sheets over the city that night, the kind of relentless downpour that blurred the edges of streetlights and turned alleys into rivers. Alexander Blackwell, a man of 32 with sharp cheekbones and even sharper ambitions, sat in the back seat of his sleek black car, staring out at the world with cool detachment. Alexander was the heir to the Blackwell fortune, a name whispered with awe and disdain in equal measure. A man of wealth, power, and ruthless intelligence, he was used to getting what he wanted. Until now. For all his riches, there was one thing he couldn't buy: time. The Blackwell family legacy was under pressure. His late father's will stipulated that Alexander needed an heir within 5 years, or a large part of their estate would pass to distant cousins. Time was running out, and Alexander, who had no desire to marry for love or trust anyone, was out of options. His driver, Victor, pulled the car to a stop at a red light near the outskirts of the city. Alexander's gaze fell on the desolate park outside. A few vagrants huddled under a bridge, seeking shelter from the storm. His eyes locked on one figure in particular, a woman sitting alone on the cold ground, her knees drawn to her chest, her head bowed under a tattered hood. She was different. Something about her, even through the rain, called to him. "Pull over," Alexander ordered abruptly. Victor glanced at him in the rearview mirror, confused. "Sir, this isn't exactly the safest part of town." "I said pull over," Alexander repeated, his voice calm but firm. The car came to a halt, and Alexander stepped out, his expensive Italian shoes sinking slightly into the mud. He ignored the rain pelting against his perfectly tailored coat and approached the woman. As he drew closer, he noticed the faint tremble in her hands, the way her shoulders shivered under the weight of the storm. "Miss," he said, his deep voice cutting through the rain. The woman slowly raised her head, and Alexander found himself staring into a pair of striking green eyes filled with exhaustion but also defiance. She was young, perhaps in her mid-20s, with delicate features framed by tangled dark hair. Her lips were pale, her face gaunt, but there was a fire in her gaze that stopped Alexander in his tracks. "What do you want?" she snapped, pulling her soaked coat tighter around herself. "I want to offer you an opportunity," Alexander said, his voice measured. She laughed bitterly, a hollow sound. "What could a man like you possibly offer someone like me?" Alexander crouched in front of her, unbothered by the rain-soaked ground. He spoke quietly but firmly, his words deliberate. "A way out of this life, a chance to start over, but it comes with a condition." She narrowed her eyes at him. "What condition?" Alexander paused, the weight of his proposition hanging in the air. Finally, he said, "I want you to have my child." Silence. The storm seemed to fade into the background as Sophia stared at him, stunned. "What?" she whispered, certain she had misheard. Alexander straightened, towering over her. "It's simple. I will pay you handsomely, enough for you to rebuild your life, to have a home, to start over. In return, you will carry my child. No strings attached." Sophia scrambled to her feet, backing away from him as if he'd struck her. "You're insane." "Think about it," he replied, his voice calm. "I'm offering you freedom, a chance to escape this life." Sophia's hands clenched into fists. "Do I look like a charity case to you?" "No," Alexander said softly. "You look like someone who deserves better." The word startled her. She had heard pity before, ridicule, judgment, but never something so genuine. For a fleeting moment, she saw something in his eyes, loneliness, perhaps, or desperation. And yet, it was absurd. This man, with his expensive coat and cold demeanor, wanted her, to bear his child? "Why me?" she demanded. You could ask anyone. Why choose a homeless woman off the street? Because you have nothing to lose and I have no time to waste, Alexander said simply. It's a business arrangement, nothing more. Sophia's heart pounded in her chest. A voice inside screamed at her to walk away, to forget this strange man and his impossible offer. But another voice whispered seductively of warm beds, clean clothes, and freedom from hunger. She thought of the nights spent sleeping on concrete, of the strangers who leered at her, of the bitter cold that never seemed to leave her bones. How much? She asked suddenly, her voice low. Alexander raised an eyebrow, surprised by her abrupt shift. $200,000? Sophia's breath hitched. It was more money than she could ever imagine. Enough to change everything. And when the baby's born? She pressed. You will have no further obligations, Alexander said, his tone firm. The child will be mine. You'll never have to see us again unless you choose to. Sophia stared at him, torn between anger, disbelief, and temptation. Who was this man, and why was he doing this? I need time to think, she muttered. Alexander reached into his coat and pulled out a business card, offering it to her. You have 48 hours. If you decide to accept, call me. Sophia snatched the card and stuffed it into her pocket. She watched him walk back to his car, his figure vanishing into the storm. As the sleek black vehicle disappeared into the distance, Sophia sank to her knees, staring blankly at the empty street. A millionaire had just offered her a chance to rewrite her life, but at what cost? And for the first time in years, Sophia found herself daring to hope. Sophia didn't sleep that night. Huddled in the damp corner of an abandoned building, she stared at the crumpled business card clutched in her trembling hands. The rain had soaked through her coat, and her body ached from the cold. But none of that mattered. All she could think about was Alexander Blackwell and his insane proposition. The name printed on the card, Blackwell Holdings, was something she vaguely recognized. She'd heard it in passing, whispered in news headlines or on strangers' lips. He wasn't just a millionaire. He was a force, a man whose power could buy and sell entire lives. Yet for reasons she couldn't comprehend, he had chosen her, a homeless woman on the edge of survival, to carry his child. The offer was absurd, degrading even, but the number lingered in her mind. $200,000. Enough to erase years of hardship. Enough to start a new life. The kind of sum that didn't just buy food or shelter, it bought freedom. As dawn broke over the city, Sophia made her decision. Her pride screamed at her to walk away, to fight another day, but her body, thin and weary, reminded her that there were no more other days. This was her chance to escape. Later that afternoon, Sophia stood outside the towering Blackwell mansion. The gates were wrought iron, adorned with intricate carvings of black roses and sharp angles, a reflection of the man who lived inside. She clutched her thin jacket around her shoulders, feeling out of place in the shadow of such wealth. Here goes nothing, she muttered under her breath before pressing the intercom. The gates opened with a low groan, and moments later, she was ushered into the estate by a man who introduced himself as Victor, Alexander's driver and right-hand man. He was polite but distant, as though he'd seen strangers like her before and already knew how this story would end. The mansion itself loomed like something out of a Gothic painting, grand but cold, its marble floors echoing with every step Sophia took. A heavy silence enveloped the space, as though laughter or life had long been banished from its halls. She couldn't help but wonder if Alexander had chosen a home that mirrored himself. Finally, Victor led her into a study where Alexander Blackwell stood by the window, his back to her. He was framed by the sprawling estate grounds outside, his posture straight, shoulders squared. He turned when she entered, his sharp blue eyes locking onto her immediately. "You came," he said, his voice neutral, though something like relief flickered in his expression. Sophia lifted her chin, determined to hold on to the small bit of dignity she had left. "I want to hear everything. The details. The terms." Alexander gestured toward the chair across from his large mahogany desk. She hesitated for a moment, then sat down, her hands fidgeting in her lap. As I explained, he began, sitting across from her, this is a business arrangement. I will provide you with shelter, medical care, and a stipend throughout the pregnancy. Upon the birth of the child, you will receive $200,000. The child will be mine to raise. You will have no further involvement unless I choose otherwise. Sophia bristled at his cold tone. And what if I change my mind later? What if I decide I want the baby? Alexander's eyes narrowed slightly, his voice dropping an octave. That's not an option. His words sent a chill down her spine. He wasn't a man who allowed deviations from his plans. Sophia crossed her arms. You act like this is just a contract, but we're talking about a human life here. Your child. Alexander's expression didn't waver, but his gaze softened just a fraction. I know exactly what we're talking about. I've thought this through, and I will ensure the child has everything they need. And what about the mother? Sophia asked quietly. Alexander paused. For the first time, she saw something flicker behind his eyes, an emotion he quickly buried. You'll be compensated. You'll have enough to start over. Isn't that what you want? Sophia swallowed hard. He was right, of course. This was the answer to every sleepless night, every gnawing hunger pain. But it felt like a deal with the devil, a bargain she couldn't undo once it was made. What happens if something goes wrong? If the baby doesn't make it? She asked, her voice almost a whisper. Alexander's jaw tightened. We don't entertain that possibility. The silence between them grew heavy, stretching out like a canyon. Finally, Sophia took a deep breath and said, Fine, I'll do it. Alexander stood, extending a hand toward her. Then we have an agreement. She hesitated for a heartbeat before shaking his hand. His grip was firm, his skin warm against hers. In that moment, Sophia realized how small she felt in comparison to the life she was stepping into. Over the next few days, Sophia's world transformed. She was moved into a suite within the Blackwell mansion, an elegant space larger than any apartment she'd ever dreamed of. The walls were painted a soft ivory, the furniture plush and luxurious. A team of doctors was brought in to ensure her health, and for the first time in years, Sophia slept in a real bed. But the opulence did little to soothe her discomfort. The mansion, though beautiful, felt lifeless. The staff avoided small talk, and Alexander himself was a ghost, always present, but never lingering. One evening, she found herself wandering the halls, pausing by a grand piano in the parlor. Dust had gathered on the keys. Tentatively, Sophia pressed a note, and its soft echo rang through the empty room. Do you play? Sophia jumped, turning to find Alexander watching her from the doorway. He was wearing his usual tailored suit, his hands in his pockets. I used to, she admitted, when I was little. Alexander stepped into the room, his gaze lingering on the piano. My mother used to play. She said music made the house feel alive. Sophia studied him carefully. For the first time, he seemed less like the cold businessman and more like a man haunted by memories. And now? She asked softly. He looked at her, his expression unreadable. Now, the house doesn't need music. Sophia frowned, sensing the weight of his words. Maybe you do. Alexander didn't respond. Instead, he turned and walked away, leaving Sophia alone with the silent piano and the faint sense that there was more to Alexander Blackwell than he wanted the world to see. Sophia's days settled into an unfamiliar rhythm, one she hadn't experienced in years, one of structure, routine, and, most surprisingly, comfort. Morning sunlight streamed into her suite every day as her new life unfolded like a strange dream. She woke in a soft bed with crisp sheets, a far cry from the cold concrete she used to know. 3 meals a day were served, and her health was monitored closely by private doctors Alexander had hired. Yet despite the material ease, she often felt suffocated. The mansion, for all its beauty, was eerily silent. Staff members moved like shadows, polite but distant, and Alexander Blackwell remained an enigma, always present, yet never truly there. Sophia would often spot him through the windows of the study, his tall frame illuminated by the golden glow of his desk lamp. He worked relentlessly, his focus unshakable, as though he lived only to maintain control over his empire. She found it unsettling how lonely such a powerful man seemed. The pregnancy brought unexpected changes to both of them. Sophia's nausea in the early months kept her bedridden, much to her frustration. One morning, as she sat on the edge of the bed, head in her hands, she was startled by a knock on her door. "Come in," she muttered, expecting one of the staff. To her surprise, Alexander stepped in carrying a small tray. On it sat a steaming cup of tea and some buttered toast. "You're up early," Sophia said, blinking at him in disbelief. "I was informed you weren't eating," he replied, setting the tray on her nightstand. His voice was calm, but there was a softness to it, almost imperceptible, that caught her off guard. Sophia raised an eyebrow as she reached for the tea. "You? Personally delivering food? Did the staff go on strike?" Alexander smirked faintly, a rare expression she hadn't seen before. "I don't trust anyone else to ensure you're eating. The baby's health is paramount." Sophia sipped her tea, hiding her expression behind the cup. Paramount. Of course, he didn't care about her, only the child she carried. Still, there was something about the way he lingered in the room, his gaze softening ever so slightly, that made her wonder if there was more to it than he let on. "Don't worry," she said with a sarcastic edge. "I'm not going to let your heirs starve." Alexander frowned. "It's not about heirs, Sophia." Sophia froze, startled by the seriousness in his voice. When she glanced up at him, she saw something fleeting in his expression, vulnerability maybe, but then it vanished, replaced by the familiar cold composure he wore like armor. "I'll let you rest," he said curtly and turned to leave. Sophia watched him go, her tea growing cold in her hands. For the first time, she felt like she'd glimpsed a crack in the wall Alexander Blackwell had built around himself. Weeks turned into months, and as Sophia's belly grew, so did the tentative understanding between her and Alexander. Though their conversations were often brief and clipped, they began to happen more frequently. She would find him standing at her door some evenings, asking, "How are you feeling today?" or, "Is there anything you need?" One night, Sophia wandered into the library, a sprawling room filled with leather-bound books and a faint smell of old paper. She traced her fingers along the shelves, mesmerized. "Looking for something?" Sophia jumped and turned to find Alexander watching her from the doorway, as he so often did. "You're like a ghost," she teased, clutching her chest, always appearing out of nowhere. "I prefer to think of myself as observant." Sophia smiled faintly. "You've got a lot of books in here. Do you read them all?" "Some," he admitted, stepping into the room. "My mother was the real reader. She used to say there was nothing more powerful than a story." Sophia turned her head sharply, surprised. "Your mother?" Alexander's jaw tightened slightly, as though he hadn't meant to reveal that detail. "Yes, she died when I was young." Sophia's expression softened. "I'm sorry." He waved it off, his gaze falling on a particular shelf. After a moment of silence, he pulled out a small, weathered book and handed it to her. "What's this?" Sophia asked, taking it from him. "A first edition," he said. "One of her favorites." Sophia looked down at the book in her hands, Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte. She ran her thumb along the edges of its old cover. "Your mother had good taste," she said softly. "Lonely women and brooding men." Alexander raised an eyebrow, his lips twitching. "Are you calling me brooding?" "If the shoe fits," she replied with a playful smirk. For the first time, she saw a real smile tug at his mouth, softening the hard edges of his face. It was fleeting, but it was there. In that moment, Sophia realized something startling. She was starting to care about him. For all his coldness, his walls, and his transactional nature, Alexander Blackwell was still human, a man shaped by loss, responsibility, and loneliness. One evening, as the wind howled outside, Sophia sat curled on the couch, her hands absent-mindedly rubbing her belly. She could feel the baby moving, tiny flutters that made her smile. Alexander entered the room without warning, pausing when he saw her. "Is everything all right?" Sophia nodded, her gaze still on her stomach. "He's moving a lot tonight. Or she. I don't know yet." Alexander hesitated, then moved to sit across from her. "Does it hurt?" Sophia laughed softly. "No, it's comforting, in a way. Like they're saying hello." A silence fell between them as Alexander's gaze drifted to her rounded belly. "It's strange," he said quietly, "knowing there's a life in there." Sophia glanced at him, surprised by the tenderness in his tone. "You don't talk about this much, do you? The baby." "No," he admitted, his voice barely audible. "I've never been good with things I can't control." Sophia smiled sadly. "Life isn't something you can plan to the last detail, Alexander. Believe me, I tried. And it all fell apart anyway." Alexander looked at her then, his blue eyes holding hers in the dim light. For a moment it felt as though the air itself had stilled. "Maybe it's time to try something new," she said softly. Alexander didn't respond. Instead, he stood abruptly as if shaken by her words. "You should rest," he murmured. "Good night, Sophia." As he left, Sophia sighed and leaned back against the couch, her hand still on her belly. She knew then that the walls between them were starting to crack, but she didn't yet know if that was a good thing or a dangerous one. The seasons shifted as the pregnancy progressed, and winter draped the Blackwell estate in a blanket of white. Snow fell silently outside the mansion windows, turning the grounds into a serene, frozen wonderland. Inside, however, the house felt warmer, perhaps because of the faint, growing connection between Sophia and Alexander. Sophia found herself relaxing into her new reality. She spent her days reading by the fire, journaling about her pregnancy, or walking through the sunroom filled with exotic plants. She could no longer deny that Alexander had done more for her than just provide shelter. He had given her time to reflect, to heal, to dream of a life she'd long stopped believing she deserved. But with that new comfort came confusion. She could no longer pretend Alexander was just a stranger or her benefactor. He was something more, someone she was beginning to see. Behind his stoic exterior was a man weighed down by grief and loneliness, a man who perhaps didn't understand how to let anyone in. On a snowy December evening, Sophia returned to her suite to find something unexpected, a small velvet box sitting on her pillow. She frowned, picking it up, her heart racing as she carefully opened it. Inside was a delicate gold necklace adorned with a small charm in the shape of a rose. It was beautiful, simple yet exquisite. Attached to it was a handwritten note. "Happy birthday. A small gesture for someone who deserves more. A." Sophia stared at the note for a long time, her fingers trembling slightly. She hadn't told anyone it was her birthday. Not that it mattered. Birthdays had always been just another day, another reminder of how little she had. And yet Alexander had remembered. Her emotions tangled together, surprise, gratitude, and something deeper, something dangerous. She hadn't allowed herself to feel these things in years. Later that night, as snow continued to fall outside, Sophia ventured downstairs. The house was quiet, the staff retired for the evening, and she found Alexander sitting alone in the library. He was dressed in one of his tailored suits, a glass of whiskey resting on the table beside him as he stared into the flames of the fireplace. "You remembered my birthday," Sophia said softly. stepping into the room. Alexander looked up, his sharp features softened by the firelight. "I did." Sophia walked toward him, holding the small necklace charm in her hand. "Why?" He looked at her for a moment before answering. "Because you deserve to be reminded that you matter, even if you've forgotten that yourself." The words struck her harder than she expected, and for a moment she couldn't speak. She turned her gaze to the fire, blinking away the sting of tears. "You're full of surprises, Alexander Blackwell." "I doubt that," he replied dryly. Sophia smiled faintly. "You hide it well, but I think there's more to you than just business deals and brooding looks." Alexander's lips curved slightly, but his eyes held something deeper, something unspoken. "You think you know me?" "I think I'm starting to," she said softly. The room fell silent except for the crackling of the fire. The tension between them was palpable, heavy with words unsaid. Sophia felt the pull, the strange, magnetic pull she'd tried to ignore for weeks. Slowly, she sat down on the couch across from him, the warmth of the fire curling around them. For a long while, neither of them spoke. Alexander watched the fire as if lost in thought, his glass of whiskey untouched. Finally, he looked at her, his gaze lingering on her face. "You've changed this house," he said quietly. Sophia blinked, surprised. "How so?" "It used to feel empty," he admitted. "Even with the staff, the silence was suffocating. But you bring something different. Life, maybe." Sophia's heart pounded at his words, at the raw honesty in his tone. She searched his face, trying to read him. "It doesn't have to be empty, you know." Alexander's expression darkened. "Some places can't be filled, no matter how much you try." Sophia reached forward without thinking, placing her hand gently on his. The touch startled him, and for a brief moment his defenses cracked. His blue eyes locked onto hers, and Sophia felt like she was staring into the soul of a man who had been alone for far too long. "You're wrong," she whispered. "You just have to let someone in." The silence between them was deafening. Alexander's gaze dropped to her lips for the briefest of moments, and something shifted. The distance they'd carefully maintained evaporated. Sophia didn't know who moved first, if it was her leaning in or him. All she knew was that suddenly his lips were on hers, warm and insistent. The world seemed to stop as the fire crackled beside them, its heat nothing compared to the rush of emotion surging through her. The kiss was tender at first, cautious as though they were both afraid of what they were doing. But then it deepened, and Sophia felt herself melting, her heart pounding wildly in her chest. She clung to him, feeling the weight of everything that had been building between them. Months of silence, of stolen glances, of unspoken words. Finally, Alexander pulled back, breathing heavily, his hands lingering on her arms. His expression was unreadable, his blue eyes clouded with something she couldn't quite place. "This shouldn't have happened," he murmured, his voice low and strained. Sophia felt the sting of rejection before she could stop it. "Why?" Alexander stood abruptly, running a hand through his hair, his composure crumbling. "Because it's not part of the agreement. I'm not..." He paused, turning away. "I can't offer you more than this arrangement, Sophia." Sophia stood too, her fists clenching at her sides. "Then why did you kiss me?" Alexander didn't answer. He looked at her once, his gaze full of regret and something deeper, something he couldn't say, before he left the room without another word. Sophia stood there, alone by the fire, her heart aching in a way she hadn't felt in years. She pressed her fingers to her lips, still tingling from his kiss, and realized the truth she'd been avoiding. She was falling for him, and she was terrified it would break her. The days that followed were colder than the snow-covered grounds outside, and the distance between Sophia and Alexander felt like an insurmountable chasm. He avoided her with practiced precision, throwing himself back into his work. Sophia, too proud to chase him, resolved to pretend as though nothing had happened, though her heart betrayed her at every turn. She could feel the child moving inside her, a constant, gentle reminder that this wasn't just an arrangement. A life was growing, a bond forming that neither of them could ignore forever. Yet Alexander's sudden retreat left her haunted. One afternoon, unable to quell the frustration boiling in her chest, Sophia wandered through the mansion. The halls were silent, save for the faint ticking of an antique clock echoing against the high ceilings. The house was beautiful but empty, a perfect reflection of Alexander himself. Her wandering took her to the east wing. A part of the house that Victor had once offhandedly mentioned was rarely used. Dust clung to surfaces here and the air felt heavier. Curiosity piqued. She stopped in front of an ornate double door with a rusted lock. It was ajar. Sophia hesitated, but something in her, perhaps desperation to understand the man who had turned her life upside down, pushed her forward. She slipped inside. The room was a study, smaller than Alexander's usual office. Shafts of pale light filtered through the curtains, illuminating an old writing desk and walls lined with forgotten books. Papers were strewn about haphazardly as though someone had left in a hurry years ago. Sophia's gaze fell on the desk. A small locked drawer caught her eye, the wood worn from years of use. On an impulse, she tugged at it, and to her surprise, the lock gave way. Inside were letters, dozens of them. Some were tied with a faded blue ribbon, others crumpled and yellowed at the edges. With trembling hands, she pulled one out and unfolded it. Her breath caught. "Dearest Alexander, I don't know how to reach you anymore. You've built walls around yourself so high that I feel I'm staring up at a man I once loved but no longer know." The handwriting was elegant, the words raw with heartbreak. Sophia's heart pounded as she read further. It became clear these letters were written by someone from Alexander's past, his late fiancée, a woman named Clara. Sophia sat down heavily, skimming letter after letter. Clara's words painted a tragic picture, Alexander's inability to open up, his cold logic overshadowing any warmth, his refusal to believe he deserved happiness or love. In one particularly haunting letter, Clara wrote, "You always see love as a transaction, Alexander, as though it's something you can control. But real love doesn't work that way. It's not about heirs or legacies. It's about trust. And until you learn that, you'll always be alone." Sophia stared at the words, tears blurring her vision. It made sense now, why Alexander was so closed off, why he had drawn back after their kiss. He didn't think he could love. He didn't think he deserved it. She carefully folded the letters, returning them to the drawer. Standing there in the quiet room, she whispered softly to herself, "You're wrong, Alexander. Love isn't something you can shut out forever." The winter deepened, and with it, Sophia's pregnancy progressed. The tension between her and Alexander had not eased since their kiss, though they pretended for the sake of civility. They spoke only when necessary, their conversations clipped and formal. But despite the distance, Alexander was always there. He would stand quietly outside the doctor's appointments, hovering nearby without intruding. When Sophia struggled to sleep, she would sometimes hear him pacing the halls late into the night. One frigid night, everything changed. Sophia was in her suite, a dull ache in her lower back worsening with each passing hour. She dismissed it at first, thinking it was just normal discomfort. But as the night wore on, the pain sharpened, coming in waves that left her breathless. Panic flared. She clutched the side of the bed and cried out, her voice echoing through the silent halls. Within minutes, her door burst open and Alexander was there. He was disheveled, his hair messy, and his shirt unbuttoned at the collar. "Sophia?" he called, alarmed. "It's happening," she gasped, clutching her belly. "The baby—" Without hesitation, Alexander crossed the room and lifted her into his arms. "Hold on," he said firmly, his voice calmer than his expression. "You'll be fine. I promise." The next hours were a blur of pain, tears, and panic. The estate's private doctor arrived, and the library was quickly transformed into a makeshift birthing room. Alexander refused to leave Sophia's side, pacing furiously when he wasn't holding her hand. Sophia, slick with sweat and tears, looked up at him between contractions. "I can't." "You can," Alexander said sharply, his voice breaking. "Sophia, listen to me. You're the strongest person I've ever met. You can do this." Something in his tone, his urgency, his vulnerability, pushed her forward. Hours later, as dawn broke over the estate, a baby's cry filled the room. Sophia collapsed back against the pillows, tears streaming down her face. She heard the doctor murmur something softly, but her attention was focused only on the small, squirming bundle placed in her arms. "It's a boy," the doctor said gently. Sophia stared down at the baby, his tiny fists curled against his chest, his cries already softening. Her heart swelled, and for the first time in years, she felt whole. "Hello," she whispered, her voice breaking. "You're here." She barely noticed Alexander kneeling beside her, his gaze fixed on the child. His expression was unreadable, but his hands trembled as he reached out. "Can I?" he asked softly. Sophia nodded. She watched as Alexander carefully lifted the baby into his arms, cradling him as though he were made of glass. For a moment, the world seemed to stop. Alexander stared down at his son, his usually cold expression softened into something unrecognizable. Awe. "He's perfect," Alexander murmured, his voice rough. Sophia wiped tears from her cheeks as she watched the man who had always been so composed and untouchable fall apart, just a little in the presence of his son. "It's not just a transaction anymore, is it?" she whispered. Alexander looked up sharply, his eyes locking onto hers. He didn't answer, but she didn't need him to. In that moment, the truth hung between them like the first rays of sunlight creeping into the room. The child they had brought into the world wasn't just an heir or a part of an agreement. He was a bridge. A bond that neither of them could ignore, no matter how much they tried. And for the first time, Alexander Blackwell looked like a man who might be ready to let someone in. The following days passed in a quiet blur. Snow continued to fall, blanketing the Blackwell estate in white, while the cries and coos of the newborn baby boy, Oliver, brought life to the cold mansion. For Sophia, the world had narrowed to this. The soft weight of Oliver in her arms, his tiny fingers curling around hers, the gentle rhythm of his breathing. It was in those moments late at night when the house was silent that she allowed herself to smile, genuine smiles she hadn't felt in years. And yet, through it all, Alexander remained distant. Present, but distant. Alexander made his presence known in the quietest of ways. She would find him hovering just outside her door when Oliver cried in the night, though he never entered unless invited. He would linger in the nursery, watching from a distance as Sophia rocked Oliver to sleep. His attempts at closeness were subtle, hesitant, as though he didn't know how to act around the life they'd created. But Sophia noticed everything. One afternoon, as the sun streamed through the nursery windows, Sophia stood beside the crib, humming softly as Oliver drifted off to sleep. She heard the familiar sound of footsteps, Alexander's, and turned to find him standing in the doorway. "You're allowed to come in, you know," she said quietly. Alexander hesitated before stepping into the room. His gaze fell on Oliver, his tiny chest rising and falling peacefully. "He sleeps a lot," Alexander murmured, as though unsure of what else to say. "He's a baby, Alexander," Sophia replied with a faint smile. "It's what they do." Alexander moved closer, his hands in his pockets, his usual armor firmly in place. But Sophia saw through it. The way his gaze lingered on Oliver's sleeping form, the quiet reverence in his voice. He cared. Perhaps more than he wanted to admit. "Do you want to hold him?" Sophia asked softly. Alexander looked at her, startled. "I don't know how." Sophia gave him an encouraging smile. "You'll figure it out. Here." Before he could protest, she carefully lifted Oliver and placed him in Alexander's arms. The baby stirred slightly but didn't wake, settling into the unfamiliar weight of his father's hold. Alexander froze at first, his arms stiff and unsure, but as the moments passed, something shifted. His shoulders relaxed and he looked down at his son, really looked at him, as though seeing him for the first time. Sophia watched silently, her heart swelling. "You're a natural," she whispered. Alexander didn't respond, but the emotion on his face, raw, unguarded, was answer enough. That night, as a snowstorm raged outside, Sophia found herself wandering the halls of the mansion. She couldn't sleep, her thoughts a tangle of emotions she couldn't unravel. She stopped by the library, the glow of firelight spilling through the half-open door. Inside, Alexander sat alone, a glass of whiskey in his hand, his gaze fixed on the flames. He looked tired, not the kind of tired that sleep could fix, but the kind born of years of carrying too much alone. Sophia hesitated, then stepped inside. "Mind if I join you?" Alexander looked up, surprised, but nodded. "Be my guest." She sat on the couch opposite him, pulling a blanket over her shoulders. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The only sounds were the crackling of the fire and the distant howl of the wind. "Why do you always sit here alone?" Sophia finally asked. Alexander swirled the whiskey in his glass, his gaze distant. "Habit, I suppose." "Lonely habit?" she said quietly. Alexander's lips twitched faintly. Loneliness is easier than disappointment. Sophia's chest ached at his words. "You say that like you've given up on people." "I haven't given up," he replied softly. "I've just learned not to expect much." Sophia leaned forward, her eyes fixed on him. "You're wrong, you know, about people, about love." Alexander looked at her sharply, his blue eyes searching her face. "Love is a luxury, Sophia, one I don't have the time or ability for." Sophia shook her head, her voice quiet but firm. "Love isn't a luxury. It's the only thing that matters. And whether you believe it or not, you deserve it just as much as anyone else." Alexander looked away, his jaw tightening. "You don't understand." "Then help me understand," Sophia pressed. "Why are you so afraid to let anyone in?" His silence stretched on so long that she thought he wouldn't answer. But then finally he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "Because the last person I loved left me," he said. "And she made me believe it was my fault." Sophia stared at him, stunned. "Clara," she said softly. Alexander's head snapped up, his gaze sharp. "How do you know that name?" Sophia hesitated. "I found the letters. I didn't mean to, but I needed to understand you." Alexander's expression darkened, and for a moment, she thought he might lash out, but instead, he sagged back into his chair, his face etched with exhaustion. "She was right," he murmured. "I push people away. I build walls. I thought if I kept everyone at a distance, I wouldn't have to lose anyone again." Sophia's heart ached for him, for the broken man hiding behind the walls he had built so carefully. She stood and crossed the room, kneeling in front of him. Gently, she placed a hand on his. "You don't have to push me away, Alexander," she whispered. "I'm not Clara, and I'm not going anywhere." Alexander looked at her, his blue eyes filled with so much emotion it stole her breath. For a long moment they simply stared at each other, the firelight dancing in the quiet room. Finally he whispered, "Why do you care?" Sophia smiled faintly, tears shimmering in her eyes. "Because I see you, the real you, and you're worth caring about." The words hung between them like a fragile thread. Alexander's gaze dropped to her lips for just a moment, but he didn't move. Instead, he whispered, almost brokenly, You're too good for me, Sophia. Sophia shook her head. Maybe you're wrong about that too. That night, for the first time, Alexander didn't retreat. He stayed by the fire, his walls crumbling just enough to let her in. They didn't kiss, and they didn't say the words Sophia desperately wanted to hear, but something had shifted. Sophia knew Alexander was afraid of her, of himself, of the life they had created together. But for the first time, she saw hope in his eyes. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. Sophia's return to the Blackwell estate was a mix of bittersweet emotions. The grand halls felt different this time, not as cold or overwhelming, but still intimidating. She carried Oliver in her arms, his tiny head resting against her shoulder as they entered through the towering doors. The staff greeted her with quiet smiles, though their expressions held curiosity, perhaps even relief. They had all noticed Alexander's transformation during her absence. Sophia's heart twisted when she stepped into the nursery, seeing it exactly as she had left it. The rocking chair near the window, the soft blankets folded neatly, and Oliver's toys waiting for small hands to claim them. Alexander lingered in the doorway, watching her. He looked vulnerable, uncertain, as if afraid she would vanish again. "This place feels less empty," she said softly, sitting down with Oliver. Alexander stepped into the room, his gaze fixed on her. "Because you're here." Sophia glanced up at him, her expression unreadable. "It's not that simple, Alexander." He nodded as if he expected her response. "I know it will take time. I'll spend the rest of my life proving myself to you, if that's what it takes." Sophia looked down at Oliver, who squirmed happily in her arms. "I'm not sure I can forgive you for how you pushed me away, for making me feel like I didn't matter." "You're right," Alexander replied quietly. "I did push you away. I believed I was protecting myself and this child, but I was wrong. I was protecting nothing but my own fear." Sophia sighed, exhaustion in her voice. "And what happens now? You say you've changed, but what if you haven't? What if you go back to being the man I had to leave?" Alexander knelt beside her, his hands resting on the arm of the chair. For the first time, she saw his walls fully gone, a man stripped of pretense, raw and open. "Then you hold me accountable," he said softly. "Don't let me hide again. I know I don't deserve a second chance, but I'm asking for one. Not for me, for us, for him." Sophia stared into his eyes, searching for the truth. And this time she saw it. A man willing to fight for love, for family, for redemption. Days turned into weeks, and something fragile began to bloom between them, a trust they carefully rebuilt, one day at a time. Sophia noticed the small ways Alexander had changed. He spent more time in the nursery, feeding Oliver or reading aloud to him from books he probably thought a baby couldn't understand. He showed her patience, listening when she spoke, learning about the parts of her life she had never shared before. They began to take walks on the estate grounds, bundled against the winter chill. Sophia marveled at how different Alexander seemed, lighter, freer, as if he had finally learned to breathe. One morning, as they stood watching Oliver giggle in the snow for the first time, Alexander turned to her. "You're the reason this house feels alive again." Sophia smiled softly, tucking a stray curl behind her ear. "It wasn't me alone, Alexander. You opened the door." "I'm just glad you walked through it," he replied, his voice low. Spring arrived, and with it, the estate transformed into something out of a dream. The cold, silent mansion was gone, replaced by a home filled with life. Oliver's laughter echoed through the halls. Staff smiled as they worked, and Alexander had become a man no one would have recognized months ago. But one day, as Sophia packed up some old boxes in the attic, she discovered something that shook her to the core. Hidden in a dusty trunk was a journal, one that had belonged to Alexander's mother. Intrigued, Sophia flipped through the pages. It told stories of her life, her regrets, and her hopes for the Blackwell family. And then Sophia found a passage that stopped her breath. It's strange how fate works. When I was a young woman, I lost everything: my home, my family, my sense of hope. Then I met your father, who saved me. He didn't know it then, but he gave me more than shelter. He gave me love. Sophia sat down heavily, tears filling her eyes. She had always believed her story with Alexander was a strange accident, a deal born of desperation. But it wasn't. It was history repeating itself. Alexander's own mother had once been in the same position Sophia had found herself in, lost and hopeless, taken in by a man who thought he was saving her, only to find that she had saved him instead. Sophia realized something then. Fate had brought her to Alexander for a reason. That evening, as the sun set over the estate, Sophia stood on the balcony, Oliver resting on her hip. She heard the soft sound of footsteps behind her and turned to see Alexander watching her. "You found something," he said, his voice soft. Sophia nodded. "Your mother's journal. Did you know?" Alexander's expression softened. "I knew she had been through hardship, but she never spoke of it much. It doesn't surprise me. She always believed in second chances." Sophia smiled faintly, brushing her hand over Oliver's soft hair. "I think she'd be proud of you. You've changed, Alexander. More than I ever thought you could." Alexander stepped closer, his gaze unwavering. "It's because of you, Sophia. You saved me." Sophia looked at him, tears shining in her eyes. "No, you saved yourself. I just held up the mirror." Alexander took a deep breath, his voice trembling as he spoke. "Then let me hold up mine." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Sophia gasped softly, her heart leaping into her throat as Alexander sank down onto one knee. "I know I've made mistakes, I know I've hurt you. But you're the only person who has ever made me feel alive, who's shown me what family truly means. I don't want to spend another day without you, Sophia. Will you marry me?" Sophia stared at him, tears spilling down her cheeks. She glanced at Oliver, who giggled at his father's kneeling form as though sharing in the joy of the moment. "Yes," she whispered, her voice shaking. "Yes, Alexander." A smile broke across Alexander's face as he stood and slipped the ring onto her finger. He pulled her into his arms, holding her close as Oliver squealed happily between them. The Blackwell mansion, once a symbol of cold wealth and empty halls, had finally become what it was always meant to be: a home. Months later, the Blackwell estate was alive with celebration. Staff bustled through the halls preparing for a small, intimate wedding. Sophia stood in the sunlit library, now her favorite room, wearing a simple but elegant gown. Oliver, now a curious toddler, toddled at her feet, clutching a small stuffed bear. Sophia picked him up, kissing his cheek as she whispered, "We did it, little one." From the doorway, Alexander appeared, wearing a rare smile. "Are you ready?" Sophia turned to him, her heart full. "I've been ready for a long time." Together they walked down the grand staircase, the sound of laughter and music filling the house. And for the first time in his life, Alexander Blackwell knew what it felt like to have everything he'd ever wanted: love, family, and a future worth living for.